why was the EU, despite having such an economic system, not able to have a grand strategy on their part when it comes to geopolitical problems that they're facing right now?
Well, just as there are many different kinds of capitalism, there are different kinds of socialism. The European socialist parties basically have been shaped since 1945 by American political interference through the National Endowment of Democracy and others. The socialist parties in Europe, you can summarize their policy. They want to lower wages, they want to support neoliberalism, and most of all, they want to fight Russia. Just as they wanted to fight the Soviet Union. So the socialist parties today of Europe are against everything that socialism prior to World War I was for, and everything that socialism used to be. When you had Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they adopted neoliberalism and out-Thatcherized Margaret Thatcher by going far enough to privatize the transportation system, the health system, making a disaster out of it. And the same thing with Reaganomics in the United States. So the question is, what's socialism? And if you look way back, I think the real way to answer this is to look back in the history of European socialism. And in a way, you could say the first socialism was the Roman Catholic Church in the 11th century in the Crusades. Their kind of socialism was very authoritarian. They wanted to, and almost all utopias in Europe were authoritarian. Thomas More's Utopia. There's a tendency of idealism to be very authoritarian. And you could look at all humanity, but you don't look at individual freedom. Well, by the 16th century, you had the impoverishment of peasant revolts, and the peasant revolts created a kind of socialism, of idealism. Thomas Munzer and the later utopian movements, the Anabaptists and the Mennonites and the Hutterites, a lot of them ended up realizing that they couldn't make a change in Europe, and they emigrated to the United States and became like the Pennsylvania Deutsch, who left Switzerland to create an idealistic community. Engels wrote a wonderful pamphlet that still is worth reading, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. So the question is, are you going to be utopian? And if utopianism, you end up somehow with the neoliberal travesty, and the scientific socialism was the Marxist value and price theory that was developed. But most socialists in Europe became social democrats, and that's sort of the bourgeois middle class party. And their idea of socialism is, well, we get rid of the landlords, we get rid of the monopolies, we have public health, we have public education, but they really didn't want to support the wage earners because they were potential businessmen. The social democrat parties sort of thought of themselves as capitalists in miniature. And they thought that, well, they want their own chance to make money and to make profits, just not for this to be done as exploitative way. A similar phenomenon occurred in the United States. The socialists in America were largely in the Midwest against the railroads, against the big employers going on strike, against the Pullman Company strikes. They were pro-unionization, and the other socialists were on the East Coast. Many of them were immigrants, especially the Jewish Bund and the anarchists like Emma Goldman, all of whom were deported under the right-wing Woodrow Wilson administration, who really set the Democratic Party and most of the American politics to say the role of socialism is to fight communism and to fight Russia. And you had that you had that sectarianism that essentially broke socialism, not only in the United States, but in Europe, into a myriad of small parties acting over, what was the ideal, and they were fighting each other much more than they were fighting the deterioration and oppression of industrial capitalism into finance capitalism. So as I mentioned, you get Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and there really isn't what we used to call socialism is a movement in Europe. Or in the United States, for that matter, that they're not even for a mixed economy anymore. By going neoliberal, they don't even want the government sector. They want to privatize almost everything, and the belief that that's efficient, and the whole concept of socialism has succumbed to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show. What is efficiency? What is productivity? And who's going to do the planning and the definition of what efficiency and productivity is?
All right, let me come at this from a couple of different angles. Number one, European socialism today, and Europe as a whole today, is a wonderful example of how mechanisms and institutions that are progressive under some circumstances, if they are not changed, can turn into their opposites and hold back human progress later on. So the two things I would bring to your attention that are famous that come out of Europe. Number one, everything that goes under the name colonialism. The Europeans leave their area and take over Asia, Africa, Latin America, not 100%, but most of it, and subordinate those parts of the world to their own needs, especially economic, number one. Number two, they compete in that process and thereby strengthen enormous difficulties, differences, and hostilities among them, because the oppression by the British Empire included what they did to the French or Belgian or German or other empires, and vice versa. The end result is that now in the 20th century, Europe finds itself hopelessly separated into a whole bunch of small countries that cannot function in the world of large countries, and with a residue of suspicion, hostility, and hatred from all the people they abused as colonial masters. And they are therefore hamstrung by the very things that made them wealthy, made them powerful, are now bringing them down. That's one fundamental thing. Then the second thing is I want to pick up on something Michael said at the beginning of his response. Socialisms are different. They always have been. Only in the caricature of anti-communism and anti-socialism do all of these things become one indistinguishable mass. So let me very simply explain about socialism. There are, I would argue, three basic ways that people who call themselves socialists are currently organizing their economies. The first one is the European. It's not only in Europe, but just for simplicity of making the points here. And the idea here is you leave the economy basically in the hands of private enterprise driven by a profit motive, more or less competitive, depending on the power of monopoly, finance, and so on. And that all that socialism means is that you soften the hard edges of that kind of economic system. The government comes in and maintains welfare, helps out the people that are paid wages so low they literally can become socially dangerous. And you provide certain public supports to the extent that the working class is strong enough to fight for politicians that will actually do that. I mean, it's important to remember that real achievements by socialists still exist in Europe. A young person in France who graduates from high school and enters the labor force, or who graduates from college and university, is required by law to be given 5 weeks of paid vacation by his or her employer. For Americans, this is an unheard of luxury. In Europe, it's taken for granted, as are universities that do not have any tuition, as are national health care services that are provided as a matter of human rights, and as a ban on capital punishment as another human right. I could go on, but that's real. I don't want to take that away from those. That's the kind of socialism. Now there's a second kind. I'm going to call it the Soviet socialism. Here we go very far in the direction of the government taking over, not just regulating as they do in Europe, not just helping with certain social services, but literally in industry, and to a considerable extent in agriculture as well, the government becomes the owner-operator of the enterprise. And that has a long history I won't go into here. And here's the third. The third is a hybrid of the first two. That's what I would call the People's Republic of China, a roughly 50-50 split between private enterprises regulated by a government and public enterprises owned and operated by the same government. Difficult to manage, so that you have a very powerful Communist Party sitting atop all of this with its entire government apparatus to manage. These are different notions of what socialism is. And what we know from the evidence is, if you're measuring in terms of economic growth, and I'm not arguing that that's the right measure or the only measure or the best measure, but if you use that measure, then it's crystal clear to me that the Chinese variant has been more successful at solving that problem of economic growth than capitalism ever did, or than the other two kinds of socialism ever did, and that the whole world is now confronted with what I just said. What are you going to do when you have a system like in China, which has been able for the last 30 years to grow their economy 5 to 9% per year, which is 3 times what the West is able to do, which continues to right now and shows no sign of going away? I mean, this is the enormity. And the Europeans are the laggards in all of this. Their socialism is the weakest in terms of economic growth. Their socialism is the most broken apart into fights between small units. I mean, they can't get the Italians together with the Belgians. I mean, this is bizarre what they are unable to do. You have parts of them that are so broken down, and I'm thinking here of the United Kingdom. They're so broken down that not only can they not question their pathetic capitalist system, but they actually decided that what was wrong there was nothing to do with capitalism, had to do with the fact that they were part of Europe. So in 2016, they vote to leave Europe, as if this would solve their problem. I could have told them. In fact, I did tell them. It's not going to solve your problem. It's going to make your problems worse, which is exactly what it has done. And by the way, That's going to make the Labour Party under Mr. Starmer the new government in England later this year when they have their election. The polls are overwhelming that the British people want this government out of there. And it isn't just because of clowns like Boris Johnson, it's also because the British effort to find a way in this situation, they're lost and they have nothing left. And the only thing that's preventing more of them from going in new directions, which they're going to do, by the way, the only thing is they are now afraid, any of them, to break because of the hostility from the United States that any effort to break would immediately incur. The United States is not going to hesitate. It looks upon the Europeans as useful idiots that they can manipulate, whether it be in Ukraine or now in Israel, Gaza. You know, the mystery, which is a mystery for only people who don't want to see it, is that the United States lets Europeans know, you go a little bit too far, you're off the list. And we will favor everybody but you, and you will become the whipping boy. Every one of you can become what was done to Greece a few years ago, and they all know it, and they don't want to go there, and they're afraid, so they can't break out of their situation. They're all pretending loyalty. That's what they're lining up for Mr. Zelensky is all about. But it has nothing to do with Ukraine, about which nobody in Europe cares. It's about their condition in this realm of socialist alternative models and how to manage that problem amidst the declining U.S. empire and a rising Chinese. That's the dilemma.
Well, we're in full agreement when it comes to our views of Europe and British socialism, but you made a number of points about China that I think are very important. Here in the United States, they keep calling China a centrally planned communist economy. And you're absolutely right. China is the most decentralized economy and has been for 30 years. They call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, but you could just as well call it industrial capitalism with Chinese characteristics because it's a mixed economy. And that's very important. They did not begin with an economic doctrine. They developed for 30 years on an ad hoc basis. And when they had their post-Mao revolution, they very carefully avoided having Marxists come to there because they didn't want to emulate the Soviet system. They wanted to sort of let 100 flowers bloom, to the point of inviting Milton Friedman from the University of Chicago over that convinced them, well, let private enterprise take off. And so what China has done is you have very little central control by Beijing of the cities and the villages throughout China. That's left, it has been left so far to local administrations to develop. And the idea is, well, let's try to shape the environment by providing for the whole economy basic human rights, basic government services, basic support for what they're doing, but let's the localities on their own. The only problem with this so far is that there hasn't been a revenue sharing, or I should say credit sharing, between the central government and the localities, which have had to finance their public spending and social spending by selling land. And you've had real estate developers developing the land, and you have shadow banks, banks that borrow money from the central bank to lend out to home buyers, and you have the kind of overbuilding and rising real estate prices that have occurred. Now, and if you look at the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal for the last few days at the Davos meetings in Switzerland, they're all saying, well, China's going to collapse right now. It's all going to be over. It's reached the end of its growth because look at the debts that it's run up for its its real estate and some of its corporations. Well, this is a complete misreading of how China is developing. I can guarantee you that China is not going to stop its economy and saying, oh, we have so much debt, before we can invest any more government money, we have to make sure that the creditors don't lose any money on their investment in the big real estate companies that have gone under, and the others. Either they're going to write down the debt, which they can do because most of the debt ends up being owed to the Bank of China, the central bank itself. Or China can say, well, I guess a lot of the small lenders are going to go bankrupt, and we'll make sure that the average depositors, the wage earners, come out okay, but we're not going to rescue the financial investors who've made bad loans that have gone bad to these companies, so that China is able to have a debt insolvency without wrecking the entire economy. But the Americans and the Davos crowd look at this and say, oh, there's no way that you can possibly write down debts. There's no way that you can possibly let the banks lose money, or the bondholders lose money, or the stockholders lose money. So China's got to collapse. There's no understanding that it's basically a pragmatic economy looking at how do we really go ahead. And China is taking an engineering, an industrial, a materialist approach to the economy, saying we're not concerned with making money for a financial class or a landlord class. We're concerned with putting in place actual, tangible means of production to provide more goods and services, to raise living standards and productivity. And that's why they're growing so much more rapidly than the Western economies. But the Western economies can't acknowledge this. They're the ideological ones that if they were to acknowledge why China is succeeding by not doing what the West is doing, then they'd have to do something different. And they're not going to. And that's why President Biden has said, China is our #1 enemy. It's their #1 enemy because it's showing that there is an alternative to Western finance capitalism, that there is a socialist alternative. And that is, as long as it exists, there goes Margaret Thatcher's motto, there is no alternative. And there goes the hope that somehow you can make the United States and European economies as productive as China has become.
Richard.
The only area where I would, it's not so much disagree, but when Mr. Biden refers to China as the enemy, I understand what Michael is saying. But I also believe that the United States has been a society that from the beginning has had to do something very odd. I mean, it happens in other parts of the world, but not as often and not as systematically as here. When one person aggresses against another, one of the saddest side effects of that act is the aggressor blaming and excusing the aggression by demonizing the person against whom you're committing the aggression as if they were the culprit aggressing against you. Let's remember, the United States is a place to which Europeans came and slaughtered the population. We are a country born in ethnic cleansing. It took 100 or more years, most of the 18th and 19th centuries, to fight an endless series of lopsided wars that were massacres, and often called massacres because it was so lopsided most of the time. And in the United States, let me give you the example that may upset some. From 1917 to 1989, there was a demonization of the Soviet Union, the great enemy. We have to do this, the great enemy, which imposes on us having to do this. The aggressor in most parts of the world for those 70-odd years was the United States and its allies, not the Soviet Union. And I want to remind you, the United States and its allies was, 20 times the economic powerhouse that the Soviet Union ever was. There was no threat to the United States from the Soviet Union for most of its history. Even when the Soviet Union got nuclear weapons, there wasn't much of a threat given the imbalance. So now the Soviet Union doesn't quite play the role for a while because they overthrow their ostensibly socialist government. And we quickly have to find another one. We found it for a while in international terrorism. This was not so good because it's vague. I mean, you want someone to hate. And so we were so desperate as a nation, we transformed the abstract idea of terrorism being our enemy by picking a few of the most weakest, absurd little potentates among the so-called terrorist countries. Saddam Hussein, how was he portrayed in the media? He was Hitler. We did it, or he was Stalin. Or look at how they're dealing with Putin now. He's another Stalin. We can't even invent new major enemies. We have to rechristen those we find now with the tried and true terrible enemies of the past. So yeah, now Xi Jinping or China can play the role. Yeah, we have another enemy to justify the cost overruns of the defense producers with which we started today's economy. And finally, a footnote to what Michael said. I think there's a remarkable thing about the Chinese that doesn't get the attention. Michael used the word materialist. He was trying to make the point that they're very practical, trial and error. Let's try this, let's try that. Something, by the way, that used to be called pragmatism and used to be something that Americans boasted as a peculiar quality they were proud of. Okay, now the Chinese are doing that kind of thing. And yet the Western media is so desperate not to look at China in anything other than the same boring, terrible enemy mentality, looks at the apartment buildings that are built before the people are ready to move into them, which, by the way, is a very ingenious way of avoiding a housing crisis in a country that has moved hundreds of millions of people from one part of the country to another. And if they didn't build ahead of it, they'd have one of the greatest slum problems in the history of the world, which they don't have, and which most of the West does have. And then I remember after the building in the United States of our interstate highway system, long before the traffic merited it. And we were lucky that we did, because it helped develop the post-World War II boom that could not have happened without that highway construction. So the Chinese are doing what the United States did, but the United States can't even remember its own history to ask why this might be a wise thing to do, even though that's what happened in its own country. Here again, the kind of self-blinder that is the sign of a system that's going down.
Well, I think that you pointed to a very important inefficiency of socialist economies and the Soviet Union in particular. They're under constant military attack from the United States. This forces them to divert much of their government spending towards military defense in order to prevent themselves from being overthrown. As soon as the Soviet Union was formed, you had a British and American invasion. you had continued subsidies of opponents. As soon as World War II ended and Germany was defeated, the Americans and the British hired as many Nazi administrators as they could and hired them to create NATO and to become administrators throughout Latin America and other countries to fight against the socialist parties. And today, the 800 military bases that the United States has built around Eurasia imposes an overhead on economies accused of being socialist and therefore enemies of the United States. They've had their GDP would be and living standards, of course, would be much higher if they did not have to cope with the attacks by the United States in Europe and the sanctions that America tried to impose first on Russia and then on China. Last week, as a part of the run-up to Davos, there was a discussion between the Chinese and the Europeans were criticizing China and saying, well, why won't you balance your trade? It's not unfair that you're selling much more to us than we're selling to you. And China said, well, why don't you sell us some of the Dutch ultraviolet chip engraving machines? Oh, we can't do that. The Americans told us not to do that because that would help your economy. This is the belligerent character of the West that is, of course, we're back to what we opened the discussion with Pentagon capitalism is. The United States has tried to prevent socialist economies from developing along a socialist track by increasing its military-industrial complex, is a gigantic technology rent recipient at the expense of the rest of the economy. When the senator, the politician who you quoted at the beginning of our discussion said, look, why can't we produce enough bullets to enable the Ukrainians to bleed Russia? The whole reason we're fighting in Ukraine to the last Ukrainian is to essentially to try to make Russia use all of its copper and lead and whatever it makes its bullets out of so that it has less money to use these raw materials to actually make useful, productive material. But a byproduct of the American attempt is the tanks that it's made, the airplanes that it's made, the arms that are made, they're not really for fighting. As you've seen in Ukraine, they're falling apart in the Ukraine. They're being just destroyed at will by inexpensive drones. These tanks and airplanes and missiles are for parades, not for really fighting. And when you actually have to fight, that would require a whole different engineering bit. So you essentially you're having the American economy is not only imposing a military overhead on the socialist economies that are not invading anybody. China has not invaded anyone. It's been invaded by the same groups, Mongolians, that invaded Russia. It's the United States and NATO that are doing the invasions, and the United States is now insisting that to help the U.S. balance of payments, Europe has to essentially join NATO and rearm because, as President Biden and Blinken said last week, if Russia wins in Ukraine, it's going to walk right through Poland, right through Czechoslovakia, and re-grab Germany, and it's just going to occupy all of Europe. And next is London, and next they're going to be in Brooklyn. This is the crazy worldview that we're talking about, and it's all parroted in the New York Times and Washington Post as if this is real world economics and not junk economics and junk politics.
I don't know. I'm afraid to continue this conversation because we're opening up, as we should, and as a responsible public media ought to, new ways of thinking about and seeing and understanding the parade of headlines that we are all engaged with every day. And your program gives us the chance to do that. And I'm therefore very grateful to you for creating these kinds of opportunities. But I will say, and if you don't mind, that I always find it a little bit daunting, because as you get into a kind of conversation like this, in a way where both Michael and I provoke and enable one another to take it another step, it's very interesting. I'm learning and I'm grateful for all of that. But you go further and further, and you begin to realize that this is unusual what we are doing, that this is not in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the LA Times or any of the other major outlets for this kind of thinking. And it isn't means that there's a systematic editorial policy that precludes, so that part of what Michael has just described is not accidental. It is part of a deliberate notion of the United States as a global hegemonic power, whose job it is to secure that power by basically making every corner of the world subordinate and serving, which it was able to do. Let's remember the history. We come out of World War II, king of the hill. The only conceivable economies that might have competed with us are all destroyed. Britain, Germany, Russia, China, Japan, they're wrecked. They're destroyed. The United States, after Pearl Harbor, no bombs fell here. No war was fought on U.S. territory after that. And the result was the war did the opposite. Where it destroyed all the competitors, here it put to work the people that had never gotten jobs in the long depression of the 1930s. The war came here and rebuilt the economy. By the way, a footnote to something Michael said. That's what's happening in Russia. Russia is using the Ukraine war to stimulate, by fiscal policy, an enormous boost in the Russian economy. So not only will this war not break Russia down, bring it to its knees, and all the other junk that came out of the highest levels of Washington, it's having the exact opposite effect. And the biggest irony is that the United States, who went through exactly that experience in World War II, can't imagine that it could happen in Russia. The bizarre lapsus of the mind. What's the world going on? What is this? Just the most amazing, selective memory that one could imagine.
Well, I think there's no truth to the rumor that President Biden is really a Russian agent, but certainly all of the sanctions that he's imposed on Russia, everything that he's tried to block other countries from providing Russia, from cheese and food to industry, Russia has done what any country under sanctions does. It's developed it itself. So it's not only the attack, the military attack on Russia, it's the sanctions that have said, well, Russia, because we know that the neoliberals and the westernizers have influenced you a lot, and you're sort of hesitating to provide protective tariffs to your industry like America and Germany did in their industrial takeoff. So we're going to help you by sanctioning your economy, which is the effective protective tariffs, so that you can build up all of your industry. That's certainly the economic effect, just as when America put the sanctions on computer chip exports to China, they've set their graduates to work to develop new breakthroughs and even more efficient computer chips. And when you impose sanctions on a country, you lose that market forever. America no longer has the Russian or the Chinese markets for what it used to be able to export. Europe no longer has Russia and China as markets because once it stopped selling to them, produce the goods themselves, and they don't need Europe anymore. And so what you have is Russia, China, Eurasia, Iran, the BRICS Plus that have now taking a new shape, not needing the West at all. All they want to do is turn their back and leave NATO and the United States economies just to go shrinking along in their own way, and in a kind of nihilistic economic way that they're doing, and be left alone. The United States and NATO are trying to whoop up enough support so that they can keep trying to interfere and somehow slow this alternative to Western finance capitalism, but obviously it's not succeeding. We're seeing it's not succeeding in the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea. It's not succeeding in the Near East. It's losing everywhere. And unless the United States can conquer the Near East by fighting to the last Israeli, and opposing China by fighting to the last Taiwanese, by convincing them to go along and be America's foreign legion, basically, America doesn't have an army. We begin this talk by talking about American military production, but where's the army to use it? What's the point of having tanks and arms and airplanes and missiles if you don't have an army to fight? And America doesn't have an army because no one wants to fight anymore. All they have is ISIS and any other Ukraine and any other country they can convince.
You know, let me give you an example, because sometimes a little example can tell you a huge part of the story. This is an illustration of the point Michael was making. 3 years ago, the #1 exporter of automobiles in the world was Germany.
Yep.
The #2 was Japan. Sorry if I have it correctly, the other way around. #2 was Germany, #1 was Japan. This last year, China jumped and became, this is just a couple of weeks ago, the report came out, in this last year, China became the #1 exporter of vehicles in the world, both electric and fossil fuel powered vehicles, jumping over Germany and Japan, who had held that position before. Okay, little lesson in economics. If you're the #1, then you are going to get whatever economies of scale this business has. And by that, I just mean the benefits you get from the sheer number of units that you produce, so you can make it cheaper per unit because you use up materials. You can buy them more cheaply because you buy larger quantities. You can process them more cheaply, etc. In other words, China is now boosted into a position of, if not dominance, near dominance of no minor industry, automobiles. How did China do that? You're going to love this. Because of the war in Ukraine. The sanctions imposed on Russia. We won't buy your oil. We won't buy your gas. We may not buy your fertilizer, your grains. All of those things led to a collapse of exchange trade between Europe and Russia. So Russia stopped buying European automobiles or American automobiles, and they bought Chinese automobiles instead. And that took China up to #1, gave them a market size larger than everybody else, therefore access to economies of scale that are going to make them an even more formidable competitor in the automobile business than they already were. So here you fight a war and you are shooting yourself in the foot. and you're doing it repeatedly. And you're pretending either that it isn't happening or that it doesn't matter. And you're doing it again and again and again. These are signs of a system in extreme distress.
Well, at least when you're shooting yourself in the foot, you're making business for the
Yes.
shooting the gun manufacturers. Look at the bright
That's right.
side.
An extra boost for them.